Today I'll show you how I made the shaker tray. Well, not this tray you're seeing now, but one just like it. I needed a wedding present for a friend, and of course I waited until the last minute to make it, so I never got a chance to get good footage of the finished tray. But here's how I made it. The first thing to do is to lay out parts. I do my best to avoid cracks and knots, and I worked in some crotch figure into the handle to add to the look of the tray, because style points are really important when you're making things for your friends. The bandsaw was working great for the rip cut until one of my kids came down into my shop in their pajamas and scolded me for waking them up with all the noise. So I had to change tactics and I had to finish the cut with my old crosscut saw. Since I love my kids and I want them to sleep well, I used my hand plane to square one edge of all the boards. My kid being mad with all the noise I was making worked out really well this time because I cannot keep my benchtop joiner calibrated. I'm not sure if it's a me problem or the machine's problem, but we're not getting along right now. The next day, with the kids safely at school and out of ear range, I was able to mill the sides and the handle pieces to the right thickness with the loudest tool I own being the planer. Then I was able to resaw the maple board at the bandsaw to give me a book matched out of this figure wood to give me the best grain possible. The next job is to glue the bottom panel together. I used a table saw to cut the edge that I wanted for my book match. This left me with a nice clean cut that I could use for the glue up. Pipe clamps have worked really well for me in panel glue ups. They also happen to be the only appropriate clamp that I have in my shop for making a glue up panel. I also like to add an additional clamp or two on the top of the piece just to try and keep it from bowing. With the bottoming clamps, I can move on to the final dimensioning of the sides and the handle pieces at the table saw. Cutting a straight line for the handle piece is actually really important for the next several steps in this process because I need that straight edge here to align all my finished pieces while I shape the handle profile. Speaking of the handle profile, I need to take time to finalize the position on the board to get the grain flow and the look that I want before I commit to cutting out the curve on the bandsaw. When cutting the curve, I try to stay a little bit outside of my line so that I can come back and trim it down to the right size with my router. I use double-sided tape to hold both of the work pieces together, and then I tape the template onto the handle parts. This is where the straight edge that I cut on the table saw is really important because I need that to align both pieces together. And by doing this, I can make sure both parts are identical when I go to route them. This saves me a lot of time and makes things just much more accurate in the end. Then I rough out the handle at the drill press so that my router bits don't have to do as much work on the inside. Without a router table, I need to be a bit creative with my work holding for routing out these curves. A holdfast is great for this, but the problem is I cannot do the entire curve without having to stop and move my holdfast. Unfortunately for me, while routing the inside of the handle, my router started to jump around and made some really weird noises. I shut off the router just in time for the bit to fall out of the chuck. This has never happened to me before, but at least I caught it on camera. After reinstalling the bit with a bit of extra torque this time, I finished my routing without any other problems. I found some unevenness in the curve of the handles the next day, probably because my bit was coming loose in the chuck and I just didn't know it at the time. I was able to fair the curve with my hand plane pretty quickly, and using a hand tool here also kept my coffee dust free to get the maximum enjoyment out of my daily caffeine. Next up is to fix the rough cuts on the inside of the handle from that router bit that went AWOL. With a progression of files and sandpaper, I was able to smooth the handle surface and get a nice matching profile that felt really good in my hand. With my joint of choice being a dovetail, I decided to do some finish prep on the inside faces of the tray. If I did any finish sanding or planing after cutting the dovetails, I might change the way the dovetail fits together and make a loose joint. I'm also using hand plane here to try and prevent myself from rounding the edges of the board, also resulting in a bad joint surface. I like to lay out the baseline of my dovetail with a knife or a marking gauge to make chiseling easier and more accurate later on in the process. My bevel gauge is set at 7 or 8 degrees because that was the look I wanted for these tails. Pencil lines work really well to mark out the tail positions. I don't need a knife line here. When I make any cut with a handsaw, I like to cut the top line first and then angle the saw back toward me as I cut the line that I can see all the way down to the baseline. After that, I level the saw out to finish cutting the rest of the board on the far side using the kerf that I just made as a guide. This is an idea I learned from Shannon Rogers, I believe. His page is Renaissance Woodworker, and it's worked out really well for me. Here's where the knife line comes in handy. I now have an accurate spot to place my chisel to finesse this joint. After all 4 tails are cut and finessed, the pin boards can be marked out using the corresponding tail. By using a marking knife, I will have the most accurate line to cut to possible, and I will again have a place to register the chisel when cleaning up after sawing. Next is to mark the base lines with a marking gauge, and then to connect the transferred tail lines to the baseline with a square and a knife. I also prefer to fill in the knife lines with a pencil to make them easier to see. The same cutting technique is used to cut the pins. Top line first, angle the saw, cut the near line, and then finish the cut with the opposite line. To remove the waste from the board, I like to use a coping saw, but I stay well off the baseline because of how easy it is for me to angle the saw down, and any mess ups now will show through in the final project. More chiseling is done now to take the waste back to the baseline. I only remove a little bit at a time to prevent blowing past my baseline, and by chiseling halfway down and then flipping the board over, I am able to keep both sides of my joint really clean and accurate, and it just makes for a much tighter fitting joint. My sawing isn't great, so I do have some cleanup to do on the cheeks of each of the pins. I needed to work on each joint just a little bit before all of them fit well, but all 4 came together pretty quickly. Now that all the joints are cut and fit, I can route the groove to house the bottom panel. On the pin boards, I can have a through groove, but this will need to be a stopped groove for the tail boards. This is why I choose to wait until my dovetails are cut, so I know exactly how far the groove will be able to go without leaving any gaps in my work. I guess I could make this a through groove and just patch it afterward, but it seems more tedious and hard to do to me. While the router is out, a small round over is needed for the handles. Now I can get back to the panel for the bottom. With my joints fit, the dimensions for the panel are finalized, and I can cut the panel to proper size at the table saw. I prefer to use my crosscut sled and a stop block for a more accurate cut, and to clean up all 4 edges of the bottom panel. Also, if something gets caught in a sled's kerf, just shut your saw off and remove it after it stops. After cutting the panel to size at the table saw, I can mark out the tongue depth for the groove on each side. A marking gauge and a pencil line are great for this. I'm once again working at night, so as to not disturb my kids, I set up a plywood fence and used an old wood body rabbet plane. With a few strokes of a knife to sever the fibers for a clean cut, I can use this old plane to take the wood down to my line. I picked this plane up several years ago and have not had an excuse to use it much, but this was a fun way to make a rabbet joint. I stop to check fitment regularly just to make sure that the panel isn't too loose.
Beauty.
For a little extra detail and one that will probably rarely be seen, I tapered the outside edges of the bottom of the bottom. Bottom of the bottom. There's got to be a better way to say that. Anyway, this small detail really adds to the look and feel of the tray for me. That raised panel look just seems like the right thing to do for a tray like this. A little pre-finishing for the panel is needed now. In case there would be any wood movement in the panel from changes in humidity, I don't want there to be any part of the panel that would be seen as an unfinished edge. So the entire panel gets finished at this point to prevent any issues with that. To glue this up, I first pre-assembled the tray and then I took off each piece one at a time and placed it in a way that I would be sure to match the correct joints back together. This makes a glue up much easier to complete and much less stressful. All went really smoothly and I needed just a little clamping pressure just to maintain a real tight joint. After the glue dried, I was able to sand and finish the outside of the tray. I made sure to get all the dovetails nice and flush and finish sanding the handles and the curves to get the look and the feel I wanted before finishing the rest of the tray. For a finish, I used rattle can shellac. I was in a major time crunch at this point and I needed a reliable and fast drying finish to get the job done. Shellac is one of my favorite finishes for a high shine or a base coat. Maybe not as durable as other finishes, but it works really well for me. I really enjoy building these trays, and I really love the excuses to use my hand tools on this particular one. This is an item I have been asked to make several times, and I've been able to sell a few of them also. If you have anything that I can do to make these a better product, let me know. Thanks for watching.